Okay. So, Stuart, you begin your book with the premise that the growth of prisons and policing in the US beginning in the 1960s was deeply tied to the Cold War and to US imperial power. Can you say a little bit about what the nature of that connection was? How did US policing impact the wider world, and how did the global context shape domestic policing?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today about my book. So, Badges Without Borders mainly covers the period from the end of World War II until the mid 1970s. And it looks, on the one hand, at how US foreign policy relied on the exportation of US policing expertise, um, both technical expertise and technological expertise. And it also then looks at how the exportation of this policing knowledge then reverberated back home domestically. During the Cold War, one of the arguments I make is that the United States national security establishment was really worried about the possibility of a revolution in a whole wide range of countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And the best way that a number of officials decided to prevent revolution from occurring, and following revolution, the development of alliances between the Soviet Union or China with country X, was to bolster the police forces of a given country. The idea was that police were the best tool to prevent low-level political agitation and activism from transforming into forms of insurgency, guerrilla warfare, and ultimately revolution. Police, the idea or the slogan, and police were the first line of defense. So the United States delivered material support to the police of 52 countries around the globe, and brought police, high-ranking police, around 10,000 or so of them, to the United States for training from 77 countries in this period. So in the book, I show that this effort, which eventually took the term counterinsurgency, which is a term that might be familiar to some of you, that had a kind of revival in the post 9/11 moment of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The counterinsurgency effort to use police to prevent insurgency or revolution, it relied on some of the most prominent police officials in the United States in the middle of the 20th century. And policing in the United States was undergoing a sort of transformation of its own, which I generally refer to in the book as professionalization. This is what many historians have called it, basically from the 1930s through the 1960s or 70s. Professionalization was an effort to upgrade police capabilities by enhancing training, enhancing the use of technology, and so forth. Part of the idea was to eradicate corruption, but part of it was really to increase police effectiveness. So these police experts in the United States really thought that the thing that they should do around the globe was try to introduce many of the same modes of professionalization that they were introducing back at home. And it often turned out that police departments in many parts of the United States were basically as underdeveloped as the police departments of so-called third world countries, meaning that they lacked rigorous training, they lacked access to modern communications technologies and other types of data management technologies, and you can just kind of go down the list. So it seemed to these experts that that the best way to, as I said, prevent revolution was to modernize and professionalize police around the globe. So that's the outward-looking part of the book, and the kind of more inward-looking part of the book is assessing how this program of upgrading police overseas reverberated domestically. And I show that there are basically 5 or so dimensions of the kind of domestic reverberations of this program, again, relying on many of the same figures. First, it led to transformations in the training of police, particularly with regard to so-called riot control, which became an obsession from the White House on down, as you might expect at the end of the 1960s. Second, reliance on technologies that had been adopted and adapted for so-called third world countries. Some of these were just cheaper and more durable versions of technologies that were used in the United States. And some of them were technologies that hadn't yet been used in the United States. And I focused in one chapter on the chemical weapon CS, which we misleadingly refer to as tear gas today. This was adopted widely in the United States based on the experience of using it overseas. Another dimension that I focus on, of course, is the techniques of policing. I look at the so-called SWAT team and the origin stories of the SWAT team, which often take us to Los Angeles. But I argue in the book, actually, we could plot more globally than simply just within the city limits of LA. And then finally, two other key dimensions: the bureaucracy that grew with the so-called war on crime in the United States. I show in the book directly drew some of its blueprints from this overseas police assistance effort. And then finally, I end the book with a discussion of some of the emerging intellectual paradigms among neoconservatives about how to solve the crime problem or the law and order problem. And I show how deeply entangled these intellectual debates about domestic crime were with debates about insurgency overseas. So all in all, the book tries to, although what I've kind of laid out is a kind of exportation and then importation, in fact, what the book really tries to demonstrate is that there was a really fluid transit of ideas, people, technologies, resources around the globe. And it's actually quite challenging to discern a clear direction of export followed by import. In fact, there were many cycles of transfer and circulation in this period, and many of the key figures that I look at in the book thought of the security problem and the crime problem as global in scope, both having very local dimensions on the street corner of any town USA, as much as around the globe in Southeast Asia or Latin America, or you name it.
Great, thank you. So for those of us who are, even familiar in passing with some of the language and arguments from the Black Power movement, there's this idea of like the internal colony, or that Black people in the US are part of a more kind of global population repressed by various forces of empire and capitalism. But even though we know those arguments, I think kind of historiographically, we tend maybe not to take them so seriously. But I think one of the things that really strikes me about your book is it's kind of a top-down look at why we might want to actually reconsider some of those older arguments. So can you say a little bit about what placing US policing in a global context forces us to rethink about the origins of mass incarceration and the expansion of police power, and just how we tell those stories?
Yeah, absolutely. In the book, one of the places I start in the book is with a quote from Bobby Seale of the Black Panther Party, and and in many ways, I could have chosen a wide number of quotations like this, but he basically makes the argument in the late spring, early summer of 1967, before the uprisings in Detroit and Newark. He says that there is going to be a long, hot summer, and of course, he turned out to be quite right. But what he says, that I quote in the book, is that the reason is that the police in Black neighborhoods in the United States are just like the occupying military forces that the United States is using in Southeast Asia. And in many ways, what I've tried to do in the book is take this theoretical analysis of figures like Seal, and again, there are many others I could name, really try to take it seriously and match it with archival research that is based on materials that were not necessarily available to activists and militants at the time. One thing that's kind of actually surprising that I found in my research is that a number of researchers of the New Left were able to get their hands on materials that were more widely available then, meaning in the late 1960s, early 1970s, than materials are available today about this sort of thing. So, but I do look at closely at declassified records, and I've basically, I think, found that the critical intuitions and analyses of these figures were accurate. It is the case that the ideas about how to police a minoritized population and how to prevent rebellions in the United States, the ideas that police were drawing on were the very same ideas that the United States was trying to utilize overseas to prevent rebellion overseas. There's a real continuum that I demonstrate archivally in these ideas. And so I think that the argument about, I think I say this in the intro, the argument about internal colonialism has been subjected to a lot of scrutiny over the years. Even future Vice President Kamala Harris's father famously weighed in on this debate. But one part of the literature, one part of the debate that I think nobody really has argued against very fiercely is the focus of the internal colonialism theory on police power. And so I think that this remains a robust and useful way of thinking. And I guess just the last thing I would say along these lines is that I think of my work in some ways as trying to demonstrate that it's possible to use what some people have called a Black power method and apply it to domains of historical analysis that usually are not where it's not usually applied, meaning foreign relations history or what used to be called diplomatic history, the history of development, national security, and so forth. I think that it's possible to use the kind of analytic tools that we draw from some of these thinkers and not only apply them as I think is the most typical way to use them, apply them to marginalized and subjugated peoples, but actually to apply them to some of the most powerful institutions and figures, particularly in US history. And I think actually that, once we start looking at US history in this way, we realize that US history might demand that we use these type of methods, because actually, if I'm correct that these policymakers and elites were thinking about the kind of problems to be solved on a global scale, and we're not drawing very strong distinctions between foreign and domestic, I think what that urges us to do, therefore, methodologically, is not remain hemmed in by the kind of borders of the United States, the territorial borders. We have to analytically find ways to transcend them, because in fact those borders are they're political artifacts, but they shouldn't shape and enclose our knowledge production, and in fact we should try to historicize them and think about how they function, and coming up with new methodological approaches to doing this, by using some of these insights of radicals who have made these arguments in the past has been really fruitful for me, and I think a lot of scholars increasingly are doing this, and it's been quite effective.
Yeah, that's really helpful, and I think for me, really, what stands out about the book is how much kind of evidence and actual kind of policy history you are able to marshal in an area that I thought of really mostly in terms of ideas or at the level of discourse, right? Elites sort of thought or talked about those brown people over there in the same way as these Black people here, but it really kind of adds so much more nuance and richness to those arguments when you show how that played out in terms of actual policy, not just sort of unconscious thoughts or kind of vague racial discourses. So you said that the terminology of counterinsurgency had a resurgence in the past 20 years in the global war on terror. I think maybe some of us are familiar with, in the last few years, there have been popular articles about how like the same tear gas that was used in Ferguson was used in various XYZ uprisings around the world. So it sort of seems like there's some aspect of this relationship that you've described that still exists today. How did the relationship between policing and militarism change in the post-Cold War context? Is there change over time? Is there a kind of narrative arc to that relationship? What are the ways that it's similar and different today as compared to the 50s, 60s, and 70s?
Mm. Well, one of the things that I try to show in the book is that the relationship between police power and military power and these institutions has long been blurry. But I do think that there's value in keeping them analytically separate, up to a point in order to then assess the blurriness. And part of the reason for that I show in the book is that there was actually in the past, and I think this remains true to some degree to the present, there's a lot of territorialism and kind of bureaucratic infighting. I mean, in some sense, a lot of my book is about bureaucratic infighting. It's about how did various policymakers and thinkers and powerful people in Washington, how did they shape the kind of innards of the national security state, and who won and who lost in various debates. So in the 1950s, during the Eisenhower administration, as many of you will probably know, the Eisenhower administration had kind of two primary modes of enacting its national security policy. One was relying on the nuclear stalemate, building up, capacities for delivering nuclear weapons, and this was quite effective in a sense, because it kept a stalemate in Europe, and there was not a land war in Europe, which of course was the thing they wanted to prevent. On the other hand, as you also know, across third world countries, the United States engaged in covert action in Guatemala, in Iran, etc. Now, when the Kennedy administration came into office, it had the idea of kind of overcoming or transcending some of these activities that the Eisenhower administration had been engaging in part because it wanted to have a more active role in third world countries in promoting democracy and capitalism. And part of this was because of a perception that the threat of communism of communist revolution was growing, right? That basically the Eisenhower recipe of nuclear stalemate in Europe and covert action in the third world was really not up to the challenge of containing the communist threat. So what would contain the communist threat? Well, bolstering police forces around the globe would be the route to doing it. So counterinsurgency as a concept, which the Kennedy administration adopts with a kind of vigor, there's a debate. Well, what does counterinsurgency mean? Does it mean actually trying to foment a kind of like liberal democratic type of revolution in places that have already gone communist? Well, the Bay of Pigs invasion kind of puts an end to the idea that that might be possible. It's such a spectacular failure. It discredits a whole wide range of officials and opens the space, therefore, for a number of other officials who have been already active and kind of waiting in the wings to take up the torch of using police for counterinsurgency. And so I show kind of that development and some of the real contingencies that went into it, but ultimately I show that these police figures are victorious and they kind of take the reins of U.S. foreign policy and toward the third world for a number of years to come. So in that sense, there's a kind of oscillation between an emphasis on a kind of more militarized mode of power and then away from that and toward a more police or civilian oriented mode. Again, as even at the same time, they really do end up blurring, because what ends up happening is that the police assistance program that I focus on in the book, you end up seeing police in, say Thailand or in some, several other countries. You see these police receiving from the United States, grenades and assault rifles and military style weapons. Sometimes they come with a Agency for International Development sticker tacked on the box, and then a memo, comes through, and I saw multiple of these memos, which is like, don't put the Agency for International Development sticker on the box of grenades because it will show that this development aid is actually meant for some other purpose besides just providing irrigation or whatever, right? So this process recurs over and over and over again, and I think basically we could say all the way through to the present, with increasing blurring of the two sides, but also still an oscillation. I think if I had to say kind of where we are in 2020, or at least in the past decade, I would say that we are increasingly seeing what I might refer to as a policification of the military, as opposed to a militarization of police, which is the kind of discourse that we use to refer to the United States, in the sense that that was what was happening during the Iraq War. And then even as the military itself, kind of ground troops have been withdrawn from various places, like Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere, the intensification of the drone program and aerial bombardment. I think we could actually analyze the drone program fruitfully through the lens of police power, even to the point of looking at some of the legal justifications that even the Obama administration used, which really drew on a legal discourse of, fleeing felons and so on and so forth. And so, again, I wouldn't say that this oscillation, the direction we're in right now, is permanent. I think we could expect an oscillation in another direction. I think this has been a consistent kind of a recurring feature of U.S. foreign policy, is this oscillation.
Okay, thank you for that. So my last question isn't about the book per se, but is more to kind of just pick your brain a little. Um, one of the things that happened when probably when both of us were in college, these kind of massive global protests against the U.S. invasion of Iraq that just sort of failed in the sense that they didn't prevent the invasion. And I think in the past 5 years since or 6 years since 2014, we've seen kind of another massive wave of protests against police violence, whose outcome is still up in the air. It feels like sort of fighting against police violence and U.S. militarism separately is already this task with far more losses than victories. And after kind of reading your book and recognizing how closely intertwined these two things are, it then can sort of start to feel like an impossible task to make a dent in either of them. So from your experience in writing the book, what are some lessons we might be able to take about why police reform has failed, and what it will take to dismantle or at least make a dent in the U.S. carceral state? How do we maybe need to think differently than we have been?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I don't have an easy answer to this, terribly difficult and complicated question. But I would say that one thing that I've noticed over the past, say since the end of May, with the protests and rebellions of 2020, is that I don't think it's a very hard sell to make the argument that I'm trying to make about the entanglement or intertwinement of police and military, or domestic penal policy or carceral policy, and U.S. Foreign policy. I walk out of my apartment and over the summer and stumble across a march or demonstration where people were holding signs that kind of made this argument, which was like rewarding in a certain sense, but also not shocking, because I just think that the kind of discourse around this sort of thing has transformed in a number of ways, in part because I think that the failures of the kind of 2015 initial Black Lives Matter push, where the Obama administration kind of took up the torch of police reform and then didn't actually really change anything, I think this led people to a more radical and thoroughgoing critique. And it has to be said that the summer of 2020 in the United States was preceded by rebellions against police violence in Chile, Hong Kong, Iraq, many other places. So I think when we take the kind of global step back and look at this globally, we see this kind of just continual cycle of rebellion on a global scale, which is fostering the very argument that we need to approach these problems as connected and I also would say that over the past several months, with the public writing I've been doing, I've been really heartened to know that, or learn that groups that have been doing anti-war activism, which of course I think post Iraq War, the kind of anti-war activism is not where a lot of people are putting their energies, but there are still young people as well as people older than me who are engaged in and their self-identification is as an anti-war activist. The DSA Anti-War Caucus, or various other groups that I've addressed over the past few months, and I think a lot of them or all of them that I've spoken to, they have said, well, look, we think that in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, it's incumbent on us to connect our analyses of war and the push for peace to a critique of police violence and racism in the criminal punishment system. So people are making these types of analyses and connections, I think, kind of organically on the ground. And that doesn't mean that it's not going to be really quite challenging to figure out how to fix some of these problems. But I think people are just so sophisticated and attuned to what's going on a kind of policy level these days. People with the defund the police push, people have really insightful and deep knowledge about how the municipal budgeting process works, in the same way that I think anti-war activists have had a very insightful critique of the way that the kind of military-industrial complex lobbies for Congress to sign a really huge Defense Authorization Act, which literally just happened the other day. So people are aware of this stuff, and then of course, but the extremely hard question still remains, like how to move from awareness and demonstrations in the streets to a kind of real radical transformation. And the hopeful side of me says, like, we're really on the cusp of this as people continue to be deeply frustrated with both the kind of endless spending on the military industrial complex for no clear security purpose. Hundreds of thousands of Americans have gotten sick and are dying with COVID, and yet we're spending $700 billion a year on the Department of Defense. Like the cost benefit analysis clearly just doesn't work. So people are compelled to think differently about this. And I think that the necessity now is to just keep pressing demands on policymakers at all levels. And I would say, go for the low hanging fruit as much as go for the really hard and very ambitious thing. So low hanging fruit would be what we've seen happen over, since the summer, which is to say, in municipal police departments, in various cities, municipal police departments should not be able to use military style weaponry or sound cannons or various forms of tear gas or chemical weapons. Like that is a reasonable demand that has been achieved in some places, at least temporarily. I think it's possible to continue doing that in lots of cities. I think that various organizations on the left are putting out kind of blueprint model legislation to be passed by city councils on issues like this, particularly also about surveillance. The EFF has a model bill that for city councils to ban facial recognition software. I think the left is going to continue to hopefully develop these types of things. It's like the right has their blueprint model legislation that they send everywhere, and I think the left should and is starting to do this, even as we recognize that, like, okay, reining in the $740 billion DoD budget is a much harder challenge, but I actually think it's feasible, and it's now or never.
Okay. Thank you so much, Stuart. So now with our remaining time, we'll open things up for questions. I'll just ask that you use the raise hand feature or type into chat, and then I'll call on people so we're not accidentally talking over each other or preventing someone from speaking who wants to. Shudita?
Sorry, I was muted for a second. Thank you so much for the sort of representation of some of these ideas in your wonderful book. Just want to pick up on a couple of things in your book that comes up. One is, your use of the notion of internal defense, which you start with in your introduction. And then, of course, the idea of counterinsurgency. I was really sort of reminded of the amazing book that long time ago Stuart Hall wrote about policing, as you know, and the idea that it had to do with some of the other softer violences that surround the hard violence of policing, which is, the idea of the city itself, the ideologies that sustain it. And in fact, he went back to Marx and talked about the idea of how the great achievement of the bourgeoisie was to create a certain common sense and acceptance about a certain level of violence in our society. Going back from that, Hall uses the word, he doesn't use hegemony so much, or that. He uses a very interesting phrase, pragmatic acceptance, in some of the things he says. And it reminded me that, how in fact, I was thinking that I grew up, actually, I can corroborate, I grew up as a school child in the late 60s and early 70s, and during the time of the ultra-left movement in Calcutta and in Eastern India, the Naxalite movement. And I saw some of these police methods in action, including deaths and things that probably a child shouldn't have to see, but and techniques of police torture were brought in during that time. And I know that the United States was involved. Now your book makes it even clearer in some ways, not as much as in places like Chile or Guatemala, but nevertheless. Anyhow, that's a subject for a different discussion someday. But thinking about this idea that, certain kinds of understanding of authority, which has to do with, management of rights, management of demonstrations, management of various kinds of left movements, which the policing included in this sort of way. I was wondering whether you can tell us a little bit more about how some of these things might have come back via those circuits back to the United States, if at all. I know that some of the ways in which the Vietnamese villages were policed, or let's say isolated for, bringing into control, even during in militarized zones, are informed policing too. I know that to a degree. So what are your thoughts on that? And the other one, the point that you used was counterinsurgency. There's a long history. I'm a historian of India, and in subaltern studies, we have studied colonial policing and how it worked to it had a long history and a long sort of apprenticeship in how to deal with anti-colonial movements in places like India or French, Indochina, a little bit shorter in India, more like 200 years, including the rise of the fingerprint and all that. In that context, I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about, how you think of the word colonial in the context of Cold War U.S. history and that concept perhaps today, because, those of us who are still interested in the long afterlife of the post-colonial would like to help and suggest that we see some things in the society we live in that are eerily reminiscent of some of those histories.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, it was a longish comment. I apologize.
Yeah, no, thanks. I really appreciate it. So I guess I would say two things in response to those two really useful points. The first on the kind of question of internal defense or internal security. I mean, these are words that I pulled out of the archival documentary record, and what I found really fascinating and troubling was that, and maybe this is something that historians always find, is that the policymakers can never quite decide what it is they're talking about, right? So they really struggle to determine what is the kind of minimum threshold at which we can say society is secure or whatever, right? And there's always this real anxiety or fear, which I think in our own experience in the kind of post 9/11 moment in the United States, I think is quite recognizable, which is that the tiniest little threat might blossom into the big threat. Of course, Condoleezza Rice, voiced this most explicitly, but it was always the case for the counterinsurgency thinkers, and particularly the ones who are really thinking about using police as the primary instrument to prevent insurgency. Prevent is kind of the key word here. What are the visible signs that insurgency might be looming, right? And what ends up happening is that the most innocuous forms of political agitation end up seeming like they might, automatically lead to destabilization, overthrow of the government, and so forth. And of course, Kelling and Wilson in their famous 1982 article "Broken Windows," have this kind of indelible phrase that they use, which is they say a kind of developmental sequence, right? The idea that low-level crime will quasi-automatically lead to more serious crime. Well, counterinsurgency thinkers thought the same thing. So writing graffiti on the wall with the name of your organization is like the first step. Passing out a leaflet is the second step, right? And so what does this mean? Well, it means that what we would consider the kind of liberal freedoms that the United States was ostensibly trying to either protect or introduce to a number of countries as the bulwark against communism actually were the vehicle of the threat to internal defense or internal security, right? So
and the news media becomes a wing of that.
Absolutely, yeah, and so it leads to clampdowns. It leads to clampdowns on dissent. It leads to clampdowns on workers' mobilizations, strike activity, trade union activity. And one of the things that I try to show in the book, and I maybe could have even emphasized even more, is the degree to which in the 1950s and early 1960s, again, because many of these experts who are doing this work overseas, they come out of the United States. They come out of a number of them come out of kind of like Rust Belt cities where there was intense trade union activity, strike activity in the 20th century, middle of the 20th century. So they go overseas and they say, look, in effect, like outlaw trade unions if you want to prevent communist revolution. Well, what does that do? What it does is it leads militants to find more unofficial modes of protest. And arguably, I think we could understand the kind of like turn to guerrilla insurgency, particularly in parts of Latin America, as the result of the U.S. U.S. implemented clampdown on the trade union.
Shining path, yeah.
Right. So the argument I make that I tried to kind of distill over this summer when I saw people, like Homeland Security, Department of Homeland Security saying like, look, in Portland, we're on the verge of a revolution because there's graffiti on the federal courthouse. And I was like, okay, where have I heard this before? And it just, led me to kind of make the argument that I really think defined the experience of the summer of 2020, which was that the policing effort, and if we want to call it the counterinsurgency effort, intensified the rebellion. It increased people's willingness to engage in public protest. It increased their bravery and their camaraderie and so forth, because people who went out thinking they were just voicing their kind of like First Amendment right to free expression and then got tear gassed or got beat up, they didn't, some of course were intimidated and terrified and went home and never did it again. But many others were just like, okay, I'm going to be out, tomorrow, and instead of being out for 2 hours, I'll be out for 6 hours, and whatever. So you can see the kind of logic. So I feel like I've kind of combined my answer to both of your questions into one now. So maybe maybe we can keep going with somebody else, and I'll return back to some of these issues.
Thanks.
So we have someone typed a question. basically asking if you can maybe give us some examples from the book, specifically an example of a country or moment that illustrates the early export of policing as counterinsurgency, and an example of the reverse, a city or a moment or a country that that illustrates the early application of counterinsurgency techniques used abroad to US policing.
Sure. Let me show you a picture that I have. Hopefully I can do this quickly and easily. Okay. So you can see this picture here. This is on the left side of the screen, in the kind of off-white shirt, is a US public safety advisor. The main institution that I focus on in the book is called the Office of Public Safety. Technically, the Office of Public Safety does not come into existence until 1962. So this guy would not have been employed by the Office of Public Safety in the 1950s, but he was doing the same work, which was technical assistance and training of police. And so what you can see here are there are three South Vietnamese police who are engaged in a car search. And they are looking for contraband, potentially weapons, but also potentially something as basic as food, or like I was talking about before, propaganda leaflets. I found this one amazing document, I think that was about Venezuela, where the directive went out that the US should train the Venezuelan kind of border police to look for propaganda bombs, which were kind of like explosive devices where when they exploded, they would shoot out leaflets that would have, communist propaganda on them or whatever. So maybe they're looking for something like that in this car search. But basically, what I'm showing you here is something that, maybe some of you who are listening have experienced this, get pulled over on the side of the street and cops say they want to, search your car, and you forget about your, supposed Fourth Amendment rights, and you say, yeah, sure, go ahead, search my car, right? So, of course, there's no Fourth Amendment in South Vietnam. So my point is this is a completely ordinary, mundane police car search. And this is what the United States was trying to teach the police in South Vietnam how to do in the late 1950s. In the period, before the U.S. military is really involved in South Vietnam. The first military advisors are killed in 1959, and that's when many people kind of date the beginning of the U.S. war. But even before the beginning of the U.S. war, there are police advisors on the ground, and they're trying to teach, and this car even kind of looks like it could be an American car, although I don't think it is. So they're trying to teach these methods. And so the point is that, in fact, we don't need to look for a really, specialized and complicated and arcane method to find what were the methods of U.S. counterinsurgency. Now, it is, of course, the case when we look at a place like South Vietnam, where, so what ends up happening after this photo, and this photo was taken, of course, for kind of propaganda purposes to show the great works that the United States is doing in South Vietnam. Look, we're teaching cops how to search cars, right? Well, what ends up happening is that the police in South Vietnam become extremely repressive. And that kind of sparks what ultimately becomes the kind of, reinvigorated insurgency that leads to the United States deciding that it needs to send ground troops by 1965. So what is necessary for that repression? When you do a car search in the United States, when a cop does a car search in the United States, what's the first thing they do? They ask you for your ID, right? Well, in South Vietnam, people did not necessarily carry IDs as a matter of course. So one of the primary tasks of counterinsurgency was to introduce an ID card. And it had to be a durable ID card that wouldn't be easily destroyed because people were supposed to carry it with them at all times. It couldn't easily be forged, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? To this day, all of us, we carry our driver's licenses, which are difficult to forge, durable identifying cards. So the experiments for manufacturers of ID cards and how to make how to develop the material that would be effective were in places like South Vietnam, and the very same corporations, they were US corporations that were designing and making them. These corporations are the ones that manufacture them for, the state of California or the state of New York or whatever, to this day. I mean, obviously there's some, it would probably be complicated if you follow the exact, genealogy of the corporations, but you get my point, that it's these extremely mundane technologies of surveillance and control and techniques of control that are crucial to what ends up becoming extremely repressive activities by the Second Republic of South Vietnam in the early 1960s, leading to the insurgency. So then, yeah, let's look back home. So what does counterinsurgency look like? I mean, I don't mean to be glib to say that like carrying an ID card in your pocket that a cop can check against their centralized database of criminal suspects. I don't mean to necessarily say that is counterinsurgency, but it actually kind of is. Like that is how the United States government imagined it would be possible to ferret out the subversive threat in a number of other countries. And of course, the Office of Public Safety introduced these types of ID cards in many other places besides South Vietnam for this exact purpose. The technology that I focus on, as I mentioned in one of the chapters of CS, which we call tear gas. CS was first used in combat situations by the United States in South Vietnam. When it was used in combat situations in South Vietnam, the idea was that, of course, in guerrilla warfare in the jungle or whatever, it's really hard to find the guerrillas. This is the great challenge of guerrilla warfare or counter guerrilla warfare. So if you use tear gas, if you use CS, they will the people you're looking for won't be able to breathe, and they'll run out to get fresh air, and they'll reveal themselves so they can be captured or killed, right? So this is how this weapon was used, and just massive quantities were used during the 1960s, during the war. But the Johnson administration, when word got out that it was using this chemical, CS, which was an unfamiliar chemical, when it was using this, it said, look, we're not violating any international law or treaties about chemical warfare, because this is a chemical that is the same as any chemical that a police department in the United States would use in a crowd control situation. That was not actually true, because CS was not yet in use by police in the United States. But the justification was a kind of law and order justification. It's like we can do this stuff in combat because we're doing it in policing. And then lo and behold, by 1968, on the recommendation of the director of the Office of Public Safety, Byron Engel, who I write about a lot in the book, on his recommendation, police in the United States start to use CS. And I have a statistic in the book, which I can't quite reproduce off the top of my head, but in Newark, in July of 1967, the National Guard fires something like 10,000 bullets and like 8 tear gas canisters or something like that. In April of 1968, after Martin Luther King is assassinated, there's unrest in many places around the United States. The National Guard, the numbers are reversed. They fire something like 8 bullets and they fire 10,000 tear gas grenades, and it's mainly CS. And this switch happens because in between summer of 1967 and spring of 1968, Byron Engel makes these recommendations to the Kerner Commission, and then they're taken up by the DOJ and the DOD to start using CS in crowd control. And Engel says, look, the reason to do it is because we know it works based on the experience of advising police in 50 countries around the globe. So there's many other examples that I could kind of point to. But the one thing I would say is that the book the book focuses on these kind of international transfers and networks, and it's not really based in any one particular city or place. One could do a research project kind of following up on some of these kind of connections, and I look at places like LA, I look at a couple of cities, but one could focus on a big city and look at all of the different ways that these types of transfers did occur. That just wasn't necessarily my particular project. It was more showing how these transfers were made possible.
Okay, thank you so much. We are out of time, and I don't see any other hands in the queue, so this might be a good place to stop, but we can't physically sort of thank you for joining us in the same way that we would if you were in person, but I know everyone feels the same way. This has been so illuminating, and I encourage everyone to read Badges Without Borders if they haven't yet. So thank you again, Stuart, for being with us.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it. It's been great to speak with you, and thanks for your questions. And certainly, if anybody does have further questions or you want to talk about some of this stuff, I'm easy to find. I'd be happy to continue the conversation.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Much appreciated. Take care. Bye-bye.
See ya.